In 1913, Congress passed a law that let private banks create money and charge your government interest on it forever. 112 years later, the national debt is $38 trillion. The interest payment alone is $900 billion a year, more than the defense budget, paid to bondholders with your taxes. And here's the part nobody explains. The Federal Reserve, the institution that creates dollars, is not fully government-owned. It's a hybrid. Regional reserve banks are owned by private member banks. J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America. They hold shares. They elect directors. They collect dividends, 6% a year, guaranteed by law, paid before the Treasury gets a dime. So the real question is not whether the Fed prints too much money. It's this: who profits when they do? And what does the debt actually represent if the money was created from nothing in the first place? If you follow the mechanics all the way through, you realize something uncomfortable. The system is not broken. It's working exactly as designed. Permanent debt, permanent interest, wealth flowing upward, and almost no one asks the question that would unravel it. If the Fed creates dollars out of thin air by buying government bonds, who does the Fed owe that money to? The answer breaks the logic of everything you were taught about money. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is the story of who actually owns the money printer, where every dollar comes from, and why the national debt can never be repaid without collapsing the money supply. Because the debt is not a mistake, it's the design. And you've been paying for it your entire life. Let's start with what most people believe. They think the Federal Reserve is a government agency, like the Treasury, or the IRS, or the Department of Defense, a branch of the federal government that manages the money supply in the public interest. That belief is false. The Federal Reserve is a public-private hybrid, and the private side has more power than most people realize. The structure is intentionally confusing. There are two main parts: the Board of Governors, which is a federal agency in Washington, 7 governors appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. That part is governmental. Then there are the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks: New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and 9 others. Those banks are not government agencies. They are private corporations. They have shareholders, and those shareholders are commercial banks, not the public, not taxpayers, banks. Every national bank and every state chartered bank that chooses to join the system must buy shares in its regional Federal Reserve Bank. The amount is set by law, 3% of the bank's capital. Those shares cannot be sold, traded, or pledged as collateral, but they pay a dividend, 6% per year, or the yield on the 10-year Treasury, whichever is lower. That dividend is guaranteed by law. So member banks earn a risk-free return on Federal Reserve shares every single year, no matter what happens in the economy. In 2023, the Fed paid about $2 billion in dividends to member banks. That money came from the interest the Fed collects on government bonds. Bonds the Fed bought with money it created electronically. Money that did not exist until the Fed typed it into existence. The Fed earns interest on assets it purchased with costless money, pays dividends to private banks first, and only then remits the remainder to Treasury. In 2017, the Fed sent $80 billion to Treasury and $14 billion in dividends to banks. The dividend is small compared to total profits, but the principle matters. Private banks profit directly from the Fed's operations. They are not just customers. They are owners. Now, the Board of Governors sets policy. They decide interest rates. They approve open market operations. But the 12 regional reserve banks execute policy. They interact with banks. They hold the bonds. They create the reserves. And 2/3 of each regional bank's board of directors is elected by member banks. That means private banks choose 6 out of 9 directors at each reserve bank. Those directors appoint the president of the regional Fed bank. And 5 of those 12 presidents sit on the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, the body that decides monetary policy. So, private banks have structural influence over the institution that controls the money supply. It is not a conspiracy. It is governance design. The system was built this way in 1913, written into law by Congress after closed-door negotiations with the most powerful bankers in America: J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, Paul Warburg. They drafted the plan. They lobbied Congress, and they won. The Federal Reserve Act was the culmination of decades of effort by private banks to centralize control of money creation. So what does it mean that the Fed is owned by private banks? It means the Fed operates with a profit motive baked into its legal structure. It means the banks that hold shares benefit when the Fed's balance sheet grows. And the Fed's balance sheet has grown from under $1 trillion in 2008 to over $8 trillion at its peak in 2022. Today it sits around $7 trillion. That growth represents bond purchases, mostly Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities. Every bond the Fed buys is an asset that pays interest. That interest becomes Fed revenue. After expenses and dividends, the remainder goes to Treasury. But when the Fed loses money, which it did in 2023 and 2024 because rising interest rates reduce the value of its bond holdings, it does not ask Treasury for a bailout. It simply creates a deferred asset on its balance sheet, an IOU to itself. The Fed cannot go bankrupt. It can print its own liabilities. That's a power no private bank has. But private banks benefit structurally because they own the shares, elect the directors, and receive the dividends. Now let's talk about how money is actually created. This is the part that changes everything. Most people think the government prints money. It does not. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing produces physical cash, but cash is only about 11% of the total money supply. The rest is digital, and digital money is created by the Federal Reserve through a process called open market operations. Here's how it works step by step. Government needs money. Congress passes a budget. Let's say $5 trillion in spending, but only $4 trillion in tax revenue. $1 trillion deficit. The Treasury Department issues bonds to cover the shortfall. Treasury bonds are IOUs. The government promises to pay back the principal plus interest over time. Those bonds are auctioned to the public. Foreign governments buy some. Pension funds buy some. Banks buy some. And the Federal Reserve buys some. Here's where it gets strange. When the Fed decides to buy $500 billion in Treasury bonds, where does it get the money? You would think the Fed has to have the money already, that it collected it from somewhere, deposits or fees, or prior revenue. No, the Fed creates the money at the moment of purchase. There is no vault, no reserve requirement, no pre-existing asset. The Fed opens its computer system, credits the Treasury's account with $500 billion, and that money did not exist 1 second before. It was created by keystroke. The technical term is expanding the Fed's balance sheet. The bond becomes an asset. The newly created reserves become a liability. But from the government's perspective, it just received $500 billion it can now spend. That money flows into the economy. It pays contractors. It funds programs. It circulates. But the government now owes the Federal Reserve $500 billion plus interest. Let's say 3% annual interest. That is $15 billion per year, every year, until the bond matures. Where does the government get $15 billion to pay the interest? Tax revenue, your income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate taxes. Every year, a portion of federal revenue goes to paying interest on the debt. In 2024, net interest on the national debt was $879 billion. That is 13% of total federal spending, more than Medicare, more than defense in some projections. And a significant portion of that interest goes to the Federal Reserve. Now here's the key insight. The Fed bought those bonds with money it created from nothing. It cost the Fed nothing to create that money, but the government pays interest on it forever, funded by taxpayers. The Federal Reserve collects interest on assets it purchased with costless money. That interest becomes Fed revenue. After operating expenses of about $5 billion a year and dividends to member banks of about $2 billion, the remainder is remitted to Treasury. But the scale matters. The Fed holds roughly $5 trillion in Treasury securities as of 2025. At an average yield of around 3%, that is $150 billion in interest income per year. Even after remitting most of it to Treasury, the system creates a flow of wealth from taxpayers to the Fed and indirectly to the banks that own the Fed. It is a closed loop. The Fed creates money, lends it to the government. The government pays interest with your taxes. The Fed profits. The banks that own the Fed get their dividends. And the cycle repeats every year. Trillions of dollars in interest payments on money created from nothing. So, who does the Fed owe the money to? That is the question that cracks the entire system open. The answer is no one. The Federal Reserve does not owe the money to anyone. It is the source. It created the dollars by purchasing bonds. There was no lender above the Fed, no depositor, no foreign creditor. The Fed simply expanded its balance sheet, and the money appeared. But the government owes the money to the Fed. The Treasury issued bonds. The Fed bought them. The government is now obligated to repay the principal and interest. That debt is real. It shows up on the national debt ledger. As of early 2025, the total national debt is $38 trillion. About 20% of that, roughly $7 to $8 trillion, is held by the Federal Reserve and other government accounts. The rest is held by the public, foreign governments, domestic investors, pension funds, banks. Japan holds over $1 trillion. The UK holds over $800 billion. China holds about $750 billion. That is down from over $1 trillion a decade ago. But here's what most people miss. Debt held by the Fed is still debt. It still accrues interest. The Fed holding it does not erase it. It transforms it. Instead of the government owing private investors, it owes the Fed, and the Fed is owned by private banks. Follow the chain. The government borrows from the Fed. The Fed is owned by member banks. The government pays interest from tax revenue. The Fed collects that interest, pays dividends to member banks, and remits the rest to Treasury. So tax dollars flow to the Fed, which flows partly to private banks and partly back to the government. It is a circular flow, but the dividends and operating expenses create a leak. Wealth exits the public sector and stays in the private banking system. This has been happening since 1913, over 100 years. Trillions of dollars transferred, and it is legal, because the banks wrote the law. Now, let's talk about why the national debt can never be repaid. This is the part that is almost never explained, even by economists. The debt cannot be repaid because the money supply would disappear. Every dollar in existence was created by someone going into debt, mostly the federal government. When the Fed buys a bond, it creates dollars. Those dollars enter circulation. If the government paid off the bond, it would return those dollars to the Fed. The Fed would cancel the bond and destroy the dollars. They would vanish from the money supply. That is not theory. That is accounting. Dollars are created when the Fed buys bonds. Dollars are destroyed when bonds are repaid. If the government tried to pay off the entire national debt, it would have to collect $38 trillion through taxes or other revenue. It would send that money to bondholders. For the portion held by the Fed, about $5 trillion, those dollars would be returned to the Fed and destroyed. The money supply would contract by $5 trillion, but it gets worse. The broader economy depends on a growing money supply to function. Population increases. Economic output increases. You need more money in circulation to facilitate more transactions. If the money supply shrinks, you get deflation. Prices fall. Debts become harder to repay. Businesses close. Unemployment spikes. The economy collapses. This is why the national debt has grown almost every single year since 1913. There have been brief periods of decline, but they are rare and short. The debt cannot shrink without shrinking the money supply, and shrinking the money supply collapses the economy. Now here's the exponential trap. The interest on the debt is not created when the loan is made. Let me walk through the math. The Fed creates $500 billion and buys treasury bonds. That $500 billion is now in circulation. But the government owes $515 billion, including interest. Only $500 billion was created. The $15 billion in interest was not. So where does the $15 billion come from? It has to come from dollars that already exist, which means those dollars must have been created by prior borrowing. Or the government has to borrow more. If the government borrows another $15 billion to pay the interest, that $15 billion comes with its own interest. Let's say 3%. That is an additional $450 million. So now the government owes $15 billion, $450 million. But only $15 billion was created. The $450 was not. You see the problem. Every time money is created, more debt is created than money. The shortfall must be filled by additional borrowing, which creates more interest, which creates a larger shortfall. The debt grows exponentially, faster than the money supply, faster than GDP. This is why the debt to GDP ratio has gone from 35% in 1980 to 122% in 2025. It is not just overspending, it is math. The system requires exponentially increasing debt to function. What happens when the math breaks? When the debt grows so large that interest payments consume most of the federal budget, we are approaching that point. Interest payments are now the third largest federal expenditure after Social Security and healthcare. Within a decade, they could be the largest. At that point, the government faces a choice: cut spending dramatically, raise taxes dramatically, or print more money. The first two are politically toxic. The third is inflation. If the Fed creates trillions more dollars to buy government debt and keep interest rates low, those dollars flood the economy. More money chasing the same goods. Prices rise. Inflation accelerates. In 2020 and 2021, the Fed created roughly $6 trillion. About 1/5 of all dollars in circulation were created in 2 years. By 2022, inflation hit 8.5%, the highest in 40 years. The Fed then raised interest rates to cool inflation. But raising rates makes government borrowing more expensive. The interest payment on the debt increases, which requires more borrowing, which adds to the debt. It is a trap with no clean exit. Now let's talk about historical precedent. A few presidents understood this system and tried to break it. Andrew Jackson, in 1835, paid off the entire national debt, the only president ever to do so. How? He refused to renew the charter of the Second Bank of the United States, which was the central bank at the time. He called it a den of vipers and thieves. He vetoed its recharter in 1832. The bank's charter expired in 1836. Without a central bank creating debt-based money, Jackson used revenue from land sales and tariffs to pay down the debt. By January 1835, the national debt was zero. But what happened next? The Panic of 1837, a severe economic depression. Banks failed. Unemployment soared. Why? Because without new debt being created, the money supply contracted. Economic activity froze. The experiment proved that in a debt-based monetary system, eliminating debt eliminates money. Kennedy signed Executive Order 110, Treasury to issue silver certificates, bypassing the Federal Reserve. $4 billion in United States notes were printed. They said United States note at the top, not Federal Reserve note. They were debt-free money, created directly by the government, backed by silver. 5 months later, Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson took office. One of his first actions was to quietly halt the issuance of United States notes. They were withdrawn from circulation. We returned exclusively to Federal Reserve notes. Executive Order 110 was never formally repealed. It just stopped being used. Coincidence? Perhaps, but the pattern is clear. Abraham Lincoln issued greenbacks during the Civil War, debt-free currency printed by the Treasury to finance the war without borrowing from banks. He was assassinated in 1865. James Garfield spoke openly about the danger of concentrated financial power. He said, "Whoever controls the volume of money in our country is absolute master of all industry and commerce." He was assassinated in 1881, within months of taking office. These are historical facts. Presidents who challenged the banking system's control over money met violent ends. The Federal Reserve's power remained intact. So what does this mean for you? It means the system is designed to transfer wealth upward, silently, perpetually. You work. You earn dollars. The government taxes you. Those tax dollars pay interest on the national debt. That interest goes to bondholders. A significant portion goes to the Federal Reserve. The Fed pays dividends to member banks. So your labor, taxed by the government, flows to private banks. Not because you borrowed from them directly, but because the government did. And the government had to borrow because the Fed controls the money supply. The Fed creates money by lending it into existence. Every dollar is born as debt. You cannot have dollars without debt. That is the system. It is not capitalism. It is not socialism. It is a debt-based fiat monetary system controlled by a private banking cartel with a government seal of approval. Now some people say, but the Fed sends most of its profits back to Treasury. Doesn't that mean taxpayers benefit? No. Because the interest payment from Treasury to the Fed is funded by your taxes in the first place. The government collects your taxes, sends a portion to the Fed as interest. The Fed keeps some, sends the rest back. The net result is your taxes paid for the Fed's operating expenses, the dividends to member banks, and the interest on money that was created from nothing. If the Fed did not exist, the government could create money directly, as Lincoln did with greenbacks, and pay zero interest. Instead, the government outsources money creation to a private cartel and pays interest forever. The interest is the cost, and you pay it. Could the system change? Technically, yes. Congress created the Federal Reserve with legislation. Congress could abolish it with legislation. The government could reclaim the power to issue currency directly, as the Constitution grants in Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have power to coin money and regulate the value thereof, but the political will does not exist. The banking lobby is too powerful. The system is too entrenched. Most politicians do not understand how it works, and those who do are often funded by the banks. The revolving door between Wall Street and Washington ensures continuity. Treasury secretaries come from Goldman Sachs. Fed chairs retire to private equity. The system protects itself. So what happens next? 3 plausible scenarios. 1. The debt continues to grow. Inflation remains elevated, and the middle class is slowly hollowed out as purchasing power erodes. Real wages stagnate. Asset prices inflate. Those who own stocks, real estate, and businesses benefit. Those who rely on wages fall behind. This is the slow bleed scenario. It can last decades. 2. The government tries to inflate away the debt by keeping interest rates low and letting inflation run. This devalues the debt in real terms, but also devalues savings, pensions, and fixed incomes. It is a hidden tax. It punishes savers and rewards borrowers. The wealthy who hold assets are protected. The middle class who hold cash and bonds are destroyed. 3. A fiscal crisis forces a reset. The debt becomes unsustainable. Bond markets lose confidence. Interest rates spike. The government cannot roll over maturing debt. The Fed steps in with massive money creation. Hyperinflation follows. The currency collapses. This is the acute crisis scenario. It is less likely in the near term because the dollar is still the global reserve currency. But reserve status is not permanent. The British pound was the reserve currency for a century. Then it wasn't. If you know the pattern, what do? You protect yourself. You understand that dollars are debt instruments that lose value over time by design. You hold assets that cannot be printed. Real estate, commodities, productive businesses, skill sets. You reduce exposure to long-duration bonds and cash. You understand that inflation is not a mysterious force. It is policy. It is the intentional devaluation of currency to manage unpayable debt. And you recognize that the system is not designed for your benefit. It is designed to transfer wealth from labor to capital, from the public to private banks, from you to them. So let's come back to the original question one more time. If the Federal Reserve keeps printing money, who do they owe it to? The answer is the Fed owes nothing. The Fed is the creator, the source. It does not borrow, it issues. But the government owes the Fed, and the government is you. Your taxes service that debt. Your labor funds the interest payments. The Fed creates money from nothing, lends it to your government, and collects interest funded by your taxes forever. The debt can never be repaid because repaying it would destroy the money supply. The system is a closed loop designed to generate perpetual debt, perpetual interest, and perpetual wealth transfer. It has been running for over 100 years, and it will keep running until it cannot. The Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It is a private banking cartel with government approval. It was created by bankers, for bankers, to control the money supply and profit from it. The national debt is not a burden future generations will pay off. It is a feature. The system requires permanent, growing debt. And every dollar of that debt represents wealth extracted from the public and delivered to bondholders, including the private banks that own the Fed. If this gave you a new lens on how the system actually works, subscribe. Because the most important truths are the ones buried under 100 years of polite language and institutional complexity. The Fed does not owe anyone, but you owe the Fed, and you have been paying that debt your entire life.